Hello and welcome to the webinar on market-based methods in greenhouse gas accounting. My name is Christoph Graf. I'm a senior economist at the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. The Institute for Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to improving the quality of government decision-making. We produce original scholarly research in the fields of economics, law, and regulatory policy, and our primary focus is climate and energy policy. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is currently considering revisions to its framework for attributing Scope 2 emissions. These are emissions generated from the production of energy, predominantly electricity. And the focus of the webinar is on the design of those Scope 2 emissions accounting framework. And we want to particularly spend time to talk about the market-based methods to legitimately reduce individual reported emissions. I'll be joined by an excellent group of guests from academia, NGOs, and industry. They will give introductory statements before we move on to a moderated Q&A. After that, we will open up the floor for audience questions. For our audience, I would ask you to submit questions anytime. At the bottom of your Zoom interface, there should be like a Q&A button. Just click on it, type in your questions, and we will address them. Before I introduce you to my guests, I would like to welcome Darek Malapragada, an assistant professor at NYU Tanton School of Engineering, to give his introductory notes on the topic. Darek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph. I'm just going to try to get my slides up and running in a minute. Okay. I presume everyone can see my screen. So thank you, Christoph, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this webinar. So in the next few minutes, I'll briefly try to describe what is the problem that we're trying to solve here for, as well as the proposed revisions of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol accounting framework and what we know from the literature on this topic to sort of help kickstart the panel discussion. So Scope 2 emissions accounting, as Christoph mentioned, is aiming to clarify the emissions associated with purchased and consumed energy on behalf of individual consumers. So if you sort of think about that problem and put it in the context of the power grid, which represents sort of a network of energy suppliers satisfying demands of a network of energy consumers, we know how to calculate the total system emissions of this power grid by measuring emissions at individual point sources. However, the problem becomes more complicated when we want to assign these emissions to different consumers and requires allocation rules, which is where Scope 2 emissions accounting comes in to establish attribution. So why is this allocation process important? This allocation process is quite important because it creates incentives for individual consumers to take action to manage their carbon footprint. One such action could involve consumers purchasing what are called as energy attribute certificates, which is effectively a mechanism to monetize renewable energy and bring it onto the grid. And this direct action could effectively be a strategy for consumers to manage their own emissions. So based on this sort of overall framing, let's take a look at what this Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 accounting is proposing. So as Christoph mentioned, there's a number of different ways in which the protocol recommends attribution of emissions. The location-based methods, which are primarily focused on emissions attributed to energy consumption only, are not going to be the focus of today's discussion. Instead, what we're going to focus on are the so-called market-based method, which involves basically looking at the emissions attributed to energy consumption while also accounting for qualifying contractual instruments, which reflect the often voluntary action of individual consumers towards managing their emissions, which would include purchasing these ESCs. In effect, what these ESCs, if they are meeting the qualifying requirement of this market-based method, would do is that they would allow for any ESCs that are able to match a certain amount of consumption of that end-use consumer could allow for that consumption to be assigned zero emissions. And so that's really where these ESCs come in handy when it comes to managing individual emissions of consumers. So if you look at what these qualifying criteria are, On the table here, I show you sort of what the current guidance is and what the proposed guidance is as part of the ongoing revision process. So the current guidance basically requires that these ESCs be matched with consumption of energy on an annual basis at the consumer level, and typically don't have any specific deliverability requirements, which effectively is trying to establish some relationship between the geographic location of the clean generation from where these ESCs were produced, as well as the end-use consumption. The proposed guidance recommends a shift from annual to hourly matching, requiring that all the certificates be matched with energy consumption on an hourly basis, and also brings in the concept of deliverability, establishing some geographical linkage between generation and consumption. There are some other criteria here that have also been included in this new guidance, particularly to deal with the portion of energy consumption that is not matched by the ESC. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into this, but I'm hoping the panel will touch upon some of these topics. So this is not a new topic, and we've seen this issue come up in many different domains. So it's worth considering what is the understanding of increasing granularity of qualifying ESCs in terms of their impacts on emissions and costs. So a good place for us to look at would be the case of electricity-based hydrogen production, where recently regulations both in the US and Europe have used similar requirements for qualification of ESCs to deem the produced hydrogen to be low carbon and eligible for subsidies. So in this particular setting, you have qualifying ESCs being purchased by an electricity producer in order to be eligible to be deemed low carbon and be eligible for subsidies. So if you look at what the literature suggests here, I'm just showing you one paper from my group where we looked at the model-based assessment of the emissions and cost impacts of these qualifying requirements, specifically annual versus hourly matching, under different scenarios of demand flexibility with respect to the consumption pattern of the electrolyzer, as well as assumptions about available existing grid policies on the other consumers associated with that power grid. So sort of there are three takeaways from this chart that you can see here. One is that there are some cost differentials that exist between annual and hourly matching. Mostly hourly matching tends to come at a premium, which would not be surprising to most in this audience. But that cost premium tends to be a function of the level of demand flexibility. Now it can, in these settings, also provide the requisite emissions reduction that is being aimed for. At the same time, we also noticed that the existence of policies to incentivize renewable energy consumption by other consumers through either renewable portfolio standards or other binding decarbonization targets can have an effect on the cost and efficacy of the annual and hourly matching requirements. So notably, you see here that under hourly matching, if you have sort of a RPS, you can basically affect the costs and emissions, but with less stringent matching standards like annual matching, you can also potentially achieve lower emissions when you have requirements on other consumers on the grid. So if we broaden out from this single study and look at what the broader literature tells us, they're largely corroborating some of the example results I highlighted on the previous slide. And many of these findings are underpinned by the idea of having additional clean generation being brought onto the grid by individual consumer actions. So the basic idea here is that we'd want to be able to measure the degree to which clean generation is directly attributable to the actions of purchasing these energy attribute certificates on behalf of individual customers. So the degree to which we can do that in the real world would effectively drive emissions reduction. There's these same arguments around costs, impacts of hourly matching that are also corroborated by other studies. And some of these cost impacts can be reduced, for example, from using different supply and demand side strategies. And finally, this problem is complicated by the fact that regional grids have different policies around load emissions reduction, and so those can also interact significantly with some of these matching standards. So with that, I'm going to pause here and turn it back to Christoph to dig into some of these topics as well as other questions with the rest of the panel. So over to you, Christoph.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was a great introduction. Thank you. Just like briefly, in an ideal setting, I think firms should be allowed to claim to be clean if their actions will lead to true additional emission reductions, right, relative to a business as usual baseline. However, I think the difficulty of like formalizing that is because that is kind of difficult to achieve in practice. This like true additionality test. So we want kind of discuss here, and I think the panelists will go into that. What are the legitimate ways to reduce reported greenhouse gas emissions? Or more specifically, how prescriptive should the protocol be about contractual arrangement using the energy attribute certificates or renewable energy credits that you've been mentioned, Tarek. With that, I'm delighted to introduce you to the panelists in alphabetical order. We have Aaron Bergman, fellow at Resources for the Future. We have Jesse Jenkins, associate professor at Princeton University and head of the REPEAT project. We have Gavin McCormick, co-founder and executive director of WhatTime. And we have Christine Priest, manager of sustainability at Stack Infrastructure, a data center construction company. And without further ado, I would like to move over to the panelists to give their introductory statements, starting with Aaron. Aaron, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, NYU, for having me. Really appreciate being here. I guess I wanted to start out a little bit sort of why are we doing this whole emissions accounting thing? And I think the answer for me is that we're using this to drive emissions reductions. And I sort of distinguish that from measuring emissions reductions. I mean, we do associate a number by doing this, but I don't really think that number is particularly meaningful. But by doing this emissions accounting, we can drive further emissions reductions. So one point I want to make briefly, which we can come back to later more on the panel, is that people talk a lot about making these changes to improve accuracy, or some people talk about credibility. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. The number by itself is much less important in my mind than about how do these things lead to emissions reductions. So with that said, I think the question I ask is how can like doing emissions accounting affect emissions? And I think there's really two major ways that you can see this happen. One is that it can impact what is built on the grid. You know, maybe instead of building gas plant, you build more clean electricity. The other way you can do this is affecting how the grid operates. So when you look at the modeling studies and some of the things, it turns out that the first thing is much more important. It's a much larger impact than sort of affecting how the grid operates. So I think one thing you see in the space a lot is that people emphasize sort of the operation of the grid, talking about things like deliverability. Can the electricity be delivered? Are you matching your load hourly? And I think that's a little bit misleading because the real focus should be on how do these things affect what is built. And so turning to that, I think there's really two ways that you can affect what is built. The first is money. If you give more money to clean energy developers, hopefully you will see more things be built. And the second is through long-term contracts, you know, where you can provide some de-risking for the clean energy developers. So I want to talk about those briefly in turn, and then I'll go on. I'll go on to the next panelist. So in this world of scope 2 accounting, the money comes from the transfer of these energy attribute certificates, which for better or for worse, I'm going to call EACs because it's hard to say energy attribute certificates over and over again. So these are certificates, you know, generated by the clean electricity generators and then purchased by the consumers so that they can claim to be consuming clean electricity. Under the current system, the prices are very low. Some might even say that they're at the level of transaction costs and have very little or no impact on project finances. What the changes proposed here, and particularly these hourly matching and the deliverability, is that they make these certificates sort of, they introduce what I'll call scarcity. Instead of just having a year's worth of certificates across the whole United States, you now have a different type of certificate for 8,760 hours throughout the year and through multiple regions throughout the United States. And what this means is that in a small number of hours of the year, maybe at night when the wind isn't blowing, there's going to be a higher demand for the certificates than are produced. And this is going to drive up the price. And so when you see these high prices in this relatively few numbers of years, that means that there is more money going to clean energy developers, and therefore you see more clean energy in the modeling. And that's really when you look at sort of the studies and the papers, that is the main thing that is driving emissions reduction, is the fact that you have these relatively few hours of the year with a high price for the EACs. Now, one important point here is that this is a voluntary system. You know, if you're in a regulatory context, people might be forced to buy this EACs. In the real world, it's an open question. What price will people be willing to pay for these EACs? And I think that's important because you could go through the year, maybe 60, 80% of the year, and only buy the zero price EECs and basically not have any impact at all. The impact you see, at least in the modeling for these, is driven by these relatively few hours of the year when there is scarcity. So the second way you can see a lot of impact on clean energy, clean electricity, is through a long-term contracts, where the clean electricity consumers enter into long-term contracts with electricity suppliers. This means that they're not subject to the risk of the electricity price. This makes the investors happier, lowers the cost of capital. And there's a lot of literature that argues that this is the biggest impact of sort of the current scope 2 accounting. So I think it's really an interesting question. What will be the impact of these proposed changes be on long-term contracts? I don't know is the short answer. I think one important issue is that right now, companies who have a lot of small loads scattered in many regions can aggregate those loads together and offset them through maybe one or small number of long-term contracts to purchase EECs. And, generally one contract is a lot easier administratively to deal with than a lot of small contracts. Now, they would not be able to do this potentially in this new system, particularly with the deliverability constraints. But I want to definitely recognize that they talk about potential exemptions in the rule, size thresholds, and things like that. So that could definitely affect that. But there are other concerns, I think, as well about how long-term contracts might work. So I think the way I look at this is that these proposed changes have the potential to increase this EEC scarcity and increase the flow of money to clean energy to clean electricity developers. But there's just a lot of uncertainty about how this system will work in practice and a lot of complications. So I don't know what will happen. We'll have to see. So thank you. I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
All right, thanks, Aaron. I think that's me up next. Hi, I'm Jesse Jenkins at Princeton University, head the Zero Lab here. And I guess to frame my comments, I just wanted to start by just talking about what is the purpose of this inventory. Well, I ultimately agree with Aaron that there's not a lot of point in having an inventory process if it doesn't actually drive greenhouse gas reductions. That's the consequential impact of these strategies. It is important to note that the primary purpose of inventories is actually to measure inputs to production and their associated emissions. And that's important. It contrasts, as I'll talk about later, to an offsets-based strategy, because an inputs-based strategy is designed to measure inputs and ideally is based on something that's directly observable, that's independently auditable, and that's uncontestable, right? We know what is going into the inputs to production. We can measure it, we can see it, and we don't need to endlessly debate about different methods to calculate what those impacts are. So the ideal case in electricity generation, the sort of simplest case would be of emissions-free inputs for electricity usage, would be a facility that was directly connected to some new clean generator. So say I have an off-grid factory or data center, and that's directly plugged into a new set of clean generators that I've built specifically to power that facility. In that case, the inputs to production are clear, right? They physically flow from one to the other. Unfortunately, grid-connected resources complicates matters. Most of our facilities that are consuming electricity are not islanded self-generating facilities. They're part of our enmeshed interconnected grid. And as power flows where it wants, based on the physics of line impedance, not point-to-point following specific contractual relationships, that makes it much more complicated to measure directly inputs to production in the case of the grid. That said, if a consumer was supplied by a clean generator that's located somewhere in the grid that's physically deliverable across those wires to the consumer, and that can actually be measured by the lack of congestion between the generator and the consumer during real-time operation. And if that producer is producing power at the same time as the consumer is consuming, then the result is functionally equivalent to being plugged directly into that generator. We're just using the grid for that connection. Of course, that's what our grids are for, allowing us to pool resources across wider geographic areas to take advantage of lower costs of production that can be achieved in that manner. Now, today, the current GHG Scope 2 protocol allows for the use of renewable energy certificates, or more generically, energy attribute certificates, as Aaron mentioned, or EACs, to represent a claim to a given unit of production or electricity supply as an input to a company's reported electricity usage. And that's been the practice for a couple of decades. The current practice allows that EAC to come from anywhere and across continental scales and any time of production, meaning that a data center or an industrial facility in, say, Ireland or Indiana could claim to be powered at night by solar produced in the Iberian Peninsula or Idaho. And that clearly raises some questions about the validity of these input-based accounting methods. And so the proposed reforms to the GHG Scope 2 are intended to better align the physical reality of power use with the claims that companies make about their inputs. Moving to an hourly temporal matching system and defined deliverability regions is a big step towards better matching that sort of idealized case I mentioned of, real-time alignment between production and consumption across a deliverable portion of the grid where congestion does not interrupt the flow of power. A consumer could no longer claim to then be using generation produced on the other side of the continent or at a time that's completely divorced from their consumption as inputs. They'd have to try to procure energy that's matched more closely on an hourly basis to their own consumption within a geographically defined region that is, we should be clear, a proxy for that deliverability. Deliverability is this is an approximation, of course, of real grid physics. Those congestion boundaries on the grids are not static, like statically defined regions, but it's an attempt to better measure, to better align the physical consumption realities with some implementable practical strategy for procurement. How well that works in practice is going to depend on how well defined those regions are and how well those kind of static definitions capture the predominant congestion flows between regions. So these reforms are all based on some measurable, empirically observable, independently auditable factors, right? We can meter consumption at a generator. We can measure consumption at a load at a given point in time in a given location. And it requires those to be much more closely aligned to the physical realities of consumption. So that's the input-based approach. What is the point of all that from an emissions perspective? Well, it's going to drive emissions reductions if, as Aaron noted, it drives flows of money to projects that would not have otherwise been built. And now we're entering the world of consequential emissions accounting, which is fundamentally a question of counterfactuals. It is not something we can directly observe in the real world because it depends on comparing the world we live in to a world where the actions we've taken to procure that clean energy or to build that data center or build that factory did not occur. That means it's not fundamentally observable in any empirical way. All we can do is estimate it using models. And here there is a growing body of research that has shown that under certain conditions that the alignment of consumption spatially and temporally can better drive these sorts of consequential emissions reductions outcomes. And it does it exactly through the mechanisms that Aaron was mentioning. By driving a clear signal of scarcity, that clean energy is abundant at certain times and it is scarce at other times and locations. And it's going to signal greater economic value for electricity resources, clean resources that can produce power at the times when it is clean power, at the times when clean power is most scarce. So it's going to encourage companies to procure new clean energy when it's currently scarce, and it's going to encourage them to shift, if possible, their consumption to locations and times when clean electricity is abundant, and they can easily procure that supply. And that's also going to encourage new solutions that aren't currently being deployed today by our conventional annual accounting, like energy storage, which can better align consumption and production, demand flexibility, which again can shift consumption to times when clean supply is more available, and the development of complementary portfolios of resources with complementary profiles or novel clean power sources like advanced geothermal or nuclear that can help fill in supply at times when wind and solar are scarce. Now, I want to note finally that this strategy really only has positive consequential impact if this procurement is driving new clean supply added to the grid. If we're simply making claims to resources that already exist in the grid today, then we're moving things around on paper without driving any consequential impact. That may be an appropriate accounting method, but it's not going to have a consequential benefit. And so this is why this incrementality concept of requiring incremental supply, at least to match incremental demand, sits alongside temporal matching and deliverability as the so-called three pillars that have been established by the literature as key to maximizing consequential impact of more granular procurement. The Scope 2 reforms notably do not require incrementality. I think that's in part a recognition that a large amount of the currently reported consumption on the grid is already there. It's not incremental consumption. And they have a standard supply concept that does try to take out a good chunk of existing clean generation like hydro or nuclear that is not in a market-based context, it's under regulated rate of return, or renewables that have been added by RPS policies or other state or federal or national policies. but it doesn't have a true incrementality standard. And I think it could be strengthened, I've said so in my comments, by adding something similar to the 45V rules for hydrogen that specify that for each load, they can only procure clean electricity that came online at a similar time frame as the load did. So if you have an old load, you can go ahead and claim old supply. But if you're a new load coming onto the grid now, like a data center added to the grid somewhere, you have to bring online new clean supply to match your consumption. Otherwise, you're simply adding demand without adding any new supply to the grid, and that's effectively going to have the same consequential impact as just being connected. Now, I want to contrast all of this though to offsets-based approach. An offsets-based approach says that my inputs might be dirty, but I'm causing some reduction in emissions somewhere else that offsets or negates my impact. And that is necessarily a consequential claim that, like other offsets-based strategies, depends on that counterfactual world that we can't directly observe. And I think we'll probably get into in the discussion into more about where that sort of offset-based approach sits alongside the inventory and input-focused strategies that are the focus of the GHG Scope 2 reforms. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. I think I'm next. So I'm Gavin McCormick. As Christoph mentioned, I'm the executive director of Watt Time, but I'm actually here representing a new project funded by Climate Breakthrough Institute. What we are doing is we are going around looking at different carbon accounting standards that are proposed from PCAF to GHGP Scope 2 to GPs for cities. And asking the question, what is based on meta studies of what's in the available literature, what do we know about the consequential impact of different options that could be passed? The reason this matters is that we've spent a lot of time looking at items like what Jesse was just mentioning. What is the impact of something like the market-based method using hourly matching with an incrementality requirement or without it? And what we often see is that it can get missed in conversations like this, just how dramatically the consequential impact depends on the details. So I'm going to walk through some different details of what could be going on here and show how very different the outcomes could be based on best available modeling. One thing that I think is worth noting, though, is that the GHG protocol has been very explicit that they do not agree with many of us on this call today that reducing as much emissions as possible is the point. They've been very explicit that the consequential impact is not priority 1 or 2 or even really priority 3. And I think we need to take that seriously. So what I'm going to be doing is sharing, here is my best assessment of the consequential impact under different options. No secret that as an NGO, we would love to see more consequential impact, but there are considerations too, such as which companies would make the money and how costly it would all be. So with all that, I will mention, I think that it's really good that we are focusing today on this point of additionality and a counterfactual, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that what hourly matching and deliverable requirements are about optimizing time and place. So just to kind of put that quick point to bed, if we were interested in building renewable energy in more optimal locations, for example, we would have to grapple with the fact that the majority of users under the GHG protocol today who are reporting electricity and purchasing EECs are located in locations where it is systematically less impactful to build renewable energy. Basically, clean companies tend to cluster in clean grids that tend to have very little fossil fuels left to displace. So the purpose of the deliverability requirement is not to optimize where things are. It's to better align with supply chains, as Jesse was saying. There's a similar effector on timing. People often assume that hourly, more granular carbon accounting would shift to better times. But we also know that, for example, it is increasingly common to have energy curtailment. There are moments where it produces no impact at all to procure additional renewable energy because the grid is throwing away surplus renewables. Hourly matching would mandate that companies must purchase some of their renewable energy at that time, throwing away a portion of that consequential impact. Similarly, the famous duck curve typically happens outside of 9 to 5 business hours. So for 9 to 5 businesses, it would actually essentially mean that the times when the grid most needs clean energy, hourly matching would be strongly incentivizing companies to cease providing clean energy at those times. So for those reasons, I am always very interested in the idea of optimizing over hourly emissions as opposed to matching over time and place. I love to point to examples like the California SCHIP program, which managed to eliminate emissions from energy storage statewide in a single year when they moved to hourly and place optimization as opposed to hourly and place matching. But at the same point, I think it is really true that we have a lot of evidence in the literature that you could see a consequential impact from hourly matching under the three pillars. And the reason for that is the volume effect. What we find in various studies by many people on this call and others is that you do get a jump in the amount of renewable energy being built that is additional under a number of studies. But what I wanted to walk through is one slide sharing how sensitive those results are to the details of the proposal. So as modeled in most papers, and Darek's paper is an interesting exception to this, this one is, just to put numbers on it, we used Open Energy Transition's model to look at 2030 in Europe. So the total emissions impact of 24/7 as modeled in papers is like so. Why does this matter? Because what we are seeing is that the different additions that the GHGP has been making to this concept heavily affect that. The most famous example is the incrementality new build point that Jesse made. What we are seeing is that it is not mandatory to actually procure new renewable energy. The studies tend to show that as cleaner grids happen, we get a smaller and smaller consequential effect from hourly matching. Other things like SSS, in the only studies we've actually seen on this, actually find that it reduces, not increases, the consequential effect. And so I think it is really important that any decisions that GCP makes after this period be based on the actual proposal that has been looked at and not based on studies of different proposals. But the other thing that really matters is the assumptions. So as was pointed out earlier, we see literally zero consequential effect under 90% matching in many different studies. Why does this matter? Because it is true that if companies adopted 100% hourly matching, you would get this really dramatic effect. But if it's really easy to coast on those 60%, or in many models, actually 90% of hours, what you get is a lot of companies asserting that they are cleaner by matching hours, but really not doing the 10% that drives all of the impact. And then the big problem is that you can end up in an environment where long-term contracts, as Aaron mentioned, which are the thing that have been shown to really cause additional renewable energy as best as we can estimate it, to Jesse's point, empirically have really caused renewable energy to happen. Hourly matching would cause their cost to greatly go up, but in general would not as substantially affect the cost of EECs. And so if there is not a requirement to do long-term contracts or additionality tests, what we see in a number of models is that companies are inclined to switch away from buying long-term PPAs and buy unbundled RECs, essentially. We did an analysis of every study we could find of in the historical past when the cost of voluntary ESG went up, how did companies actually respond? And it was quite concerning. What we actually find is that the cost estimates we find from various different estimates in the literature, every estimate we could find, would actually predict at historical price elasticities, we would see 100% drop in renewable energy purchasing. It would literally kill the market. Now, I don't actually believe that that will happen because that's a linear extrapolation. But when models show that dramatic a pullback, we should ask the question, are companies planning to build more renewable energy as a result of this? And so I wanted to just quickly give one last graph is to show the record of companies that have adopted hourly matching voluntarily or doing anticipatory compliance. What we are seeing is that companies like Google that have adopted hourly matching are reporting they've actually dropped their renewable energy purchasing relative to competitors. And companies like Meta that have been doing some anticipatory compliance have indeed switched from building incremental new renewable energy to procuring flat energy that is not new. And so there's very strong reason to believe that what we are actually seeing from firms in the market, what is predicted by theory, and what firms say they will do in surveys, is respond to this not by building more clean energy as would be very effective, but instead essentially coasting on that partial hourly matching and moving towards away from PPAs towards RECs. And so my concern is that although on theory hourly matching will be highly effective, the best available research we have suggests that in practice in a voluntary market, what it will actually cause is a significant shift away from the optimal times and from building of clean energy. And this is why I think GCP should look carefully at things like what SGIP did as an alternative form of hourly optimization. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, so far. And I promise I'm sort of the last spiel before we get into a more dynamic discussion. But thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. And thanks to Policy Integrity for having me for this practical conversation about what the Scope 2 reforms are trying to achieve, whether they can actually achieve that, and most importantly to me, what it would take to implement reforms without breaking participation in renewable energy markets. Today's panel is a chance to bring a little bit of clarity to an area that's become perhaps surprisingly polarizing for those who don't sleep and breathe Scope 2 accounting, which may be some number of you in the audience, but you'll hear many of us agree and some of us disagree on the objective, but still disagree on what proxies are most effective, how deliverability should be defined, how to handle or not to even touch incrementality in a way that's credible and workable. But as you listen to kind of all these perspectives and all these considerations, I would encourage you to focus on a few questions. What choices is this actually going to change for companies in the real world, meaning where they contract and how, what they build, how they operate, and also what data or infrastructure needs to exist for any reforms to be implementable, consistent, and comparable across regions, considering that many companies following these accounting rules have global operations. From my perspective, there's really two goals that matter here. First, that Scope 2 reporting needs to be credible and auditable, using rules that are observable and enforceable. And second, that it needs to be connected to real world emissions outcomes that you can really point to. And I know this is the tricky part to align on the best proxies for. Unfortunately, there is a tension in the business world in that the more you push for granularity, the more you increase complexity, cost, and the risk that companies opt out or reduce their procurement ambition. Of course, on the other hand, if you keep rules a bit more flexible, you can preserve participation, but risk green claims that are conceptually hard to defend and perhaps disconnected from system impact. So what I would personally really like to see these reforms prioritize is a way to keep the accounting rules as simple as possible and rooted in those observable, auditable characteristics, but without ambitions per se or incentives embedded in the framework. As Gavin mentioned, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has affirmed that the consequential element isn't their goal. And I think that's really important because this Greenhouse Gas Protocol is what's referenced in regulatory reporting requirements and other expectations without specific grid decarbonization ambitions, but rather transparency ambitions and comparability. Accounting rules are really intended to account for numbers in a consistent way, not drive change. So companies who have climate-related goals to reduce emissions should be able to perform the standard accounting and should be ready to do so. But under a separate parallel workstream, they should always be looking at the suite of options available to them to drive emissions reductions according to their own theory of change for maximal impact, risk reduction, competitive differentiation, or all the above. And that isn't to say that accounting standards shouldn't evolve as our operating reality changes and data improves as it has over the past 10 to 15 years. We've been using this iteration of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but how do we evolve them in a way that doesn't create unintended consequences of either lower participation or everyone just charting their own path on how they interact with renewables markets, making numbers out in the market incomparable? Really, what I'm getting at here is that I don't want to lose sight of, and I'll close my remarks here with, the fact that a portfolio approach to energy use is really what's most important. Renewable electricity procurement attributes matter, but they are only one lever. Grid policy, energy efficiency, siting decisions, flexible load management, storage and on-site solutions all need to work together, and focusing only on the certificates and market-based accounting risks missing higher impact actions when our shared goal is overall a sustainable energy system. So this mindset also allows companies to kind of maintain their own North Star while the accounting rules are in flux and certain elements such as the boundaries of deliverability haven't even been defined yet. So just a preface on kind of how are we really going to implement this when we even agree on the reforms. But with that, I'll hand it back to Christoph to guide us into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you all for your contributions. Before I start with questions, I would like to ask the panel if you have reactions to each other. So did something occur where you want to really push back, or if you want to re-emphasize? So I want to just give you the chance to whoever is first to start with something that popped out.
Maybe I'll jump in. I wanted to maybe ask a clarifying question for Gavin. Is you're showing on some of your plots changes in scope 2 emissions. Are those based on the current accounting rules or
Right.
based on annual accounting, or are you trying to measure attributable impacts? I think those are, obviously all different things, and showing an empirical chart of increasing emissions doesn't show that there has been no consequential impact, because that would require the other line that we can't observe, which is the actual counterfactual scenario. So this is, again, the challenge with any empirical observation of, you cannot empirically observe the counterfactual, so we can't really make any empirical claims about counterfactual impacts. We can only make modeled, estimatable claims. So curious just to clarify your view there.
Yeah, thanks, Azul Rush. So what that is the Scope 2 official reported numbers, and so those are all under the current method. I 110% agree with you. That data alone is not sufficient to know what did we really do. I think I'm more bullish than you sometimes on how well can we approximate it. So one thing that I have access to that wasn't in that graph is what share of those purchases were long-term contracts. Looking at work like Gillen Waters, there's, I think, pretty good evidence that those tend to be more additional. And so we can actually look at claims like how much has big picture do we think this affected the share that is additional? Completely agree. Looking at the current scope 2 doesn't tell you that question.
Yeah, and so again, I think this just raises the question about what are we trying to do with an accounting scheme, and I think what we're all hearing is there are various strategies one can pursue to have consequential impact. A lot of those are very difficult to measure in any defensible way. Some of them can be measured approximately in a defensible way, and maybe we can all come to agreement on some strategies versus others. But they're always going to have this fundamental question of what is the actual number? I can't observe what it is. And so my view is that does not belong in a inputs-based accounting scheme like Scope 2, and I think we've sort of all seem to be generally agreeing on that. So I'd be curious if there's any countervailing view on that. Companies can, of course, also, as Christine said, pursue a variety of strategies to have consequential impact and just be good citizens in the world, right? If that's what the company wants to do. Hourly accounting, with 3 pillars is one way to increase the consequential impact of the current Scope 2 rules. It is not the optimal strategy for consequential impact, and I think we, have to differentiate those two things. It's a improvement in the way we do the input-based accounting that is likely to increase consequential impact. It does not preclude other strategies for maximizing impact as well.
And I think also related to that, it might be useful to think also about the price tag, right? So as I think Aaron and Christine mentioned, that the assumptions that the EEC elasticity, that basically consumers are inelastic with respect to the renewable energy certificates or EECs is maybe true for some hyperscalers, which have comfortable profit margins. But this should be a protocol valid for the whole economy. So maybe that's another point to consider. And I just want to throw it out to the panel and ask for reactions also with respect to the pricing part of the consequences of the reform of the protocol.
I mean, one point I'll just make is, in some ways, increased prices is a feature, not a bug. If you want people to build more clean energy, it's going to cost more money, and that's just a fundamental fact of life. I think, it is. I can't plug into my model and figure out which companies will decide things are too expensive and which ones will not. It's just, that's going to be up to them and the environment and how they want to, put themselves forward to the world. I do think it is important, and maybe I'll say again what Jesse said, but maybe a different spin on it is, this I would definitely agree that this is a clever way to increase the odds that, these emissions accounting will have consequential emissions impact. It does create complications, and it's probably not if you wanted to, you were a central planner, which of course we're not and wouldn't want, but to figure out the best way or the cheapest way to get lower emissions, this would not be it. And so, it just becomes a question about the trade-offs, and it's hard. what will these companies do? What will the impacts be on these long-term contracts? It's just there's a lot of uncertainty with these changes. I mean, I think we can see how they work in modeling world with it's very clean, but as we translate this to the new world, I think into the real world, this is going to be a challenge. I think it's important that there are some exemptions and transition stuff in the rule, but I couldn't sit here and tell you like, whether 2 years or 3 years is right, or what is the right size for an exemption for a load. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, well said, Aaron. I think I was going to try to raise most of those same points. I do think that key thing to pause on is that if you want to have consequential impact, it's going to cost money, right? Because the whole point of consequential impact is driving something additional, something that would not have occurred otherwise. And so if current incentives in the market are to do one thing, then they're that's what you're going to do anyway. And that's what everybody else is going to do anyway. And that's actually one of the key motivators for this reform is that over time, as renewables have gotten cheaper, the default strategy for procurement has been buy renewables, at least for a large portion of your long-term, contracting or for your load. And so that wasn't true 10 years ago, wasn't true 5 years ago, but it is now. It's also not universally true in every market in the world. And maybe there should be some acknowledgement of that in the way the Scope 2 rules work. But basically, as all of our work has shown, if renewables are already the thing that you would build to meet the next increment of load, then buying those renewables is just what makes sense in the market. And so if you want to have a consequential impact, you have to go do something somewhere that wouldn't otherwise happen. And that's going to come at an added cost relative to the market. And so this is actually, I think, one of the key challenges of an offsets-based approach is that an offsets-based approach is kind of trying to find the most emissions reductions per dollar spent. And that is actually going to drive you towards strategies that are less likely to be additional. This has been the whole problem with, forestry offsets and land use offsets and other things is the high quality offsets, the ones that are most likely to be additional, are the most expensive. But if you're optimizing for how many offsets can I book per dollar spent, I'm going to want to go and do the things that are cheapest, that give me the most, emissions on paper per dollar spent. And that tension is very real in the offsets world as well. So it's going to be true for any kind of emissions accounting based, electricity procurement strategy also, and something we have to guard against. And so if you're, there's no free lunch here. If you're seeing that a strategy can get you to quote unquote zero emissions or 100% clean electricity with very little or no added cost, it's very likely that strategy is not additional. It's not likely to drive consequential impact. And maybe that's fine from an accounting perspective. You claim that your inputs are clean, but it is not having much of an impact, on the actual trajectory of emissions. So creating that scarcity for energy attributes that are occurring at times and places when we don't already have an abundance, that signal to pull more demand onto the grid or start more supply during those hours onto that grid, that's the incremental signal that the hourly matching deliverability requirements are sending. Similarly, if you're buying clean energy in a part of the world where it's not already cost effective, it's not the thing getting built, and you're paying more for that to get more clean energy built in some place where the grid is relatively dirty, sure, that's going to have a positive impact, but it's also not going to come cheap. And so we just have to keep that tension in mind. Consequential impact is likely to cost real money. And for companies who want to have that impact and are willing to spend that money, they're the ones we should be celebrating for doing something different, doing something that wouldn't have otherwise occurred.
I think we need to
And I
keep in
think
mind that, oh, please
many
go
of us,
on. Yeah.
I think many of us can agree with the benefits of price signals for higher quality attributes. But what we're still missing in this conversation is the cost associated just with implementation. And so, yes, you want the higher quality attribute to cost more. That makes sense logically. But when the accounting rules become so complex in a realm that most companies in the world do not have in-house sophistication around, just participation and figuring out how you calculate this and report it in a defensible way becomes and its own cost because you have to hire additional experts. It's taken a decade for companies to even get their arms around what this current definition of Scope 2 means. And so I don't want to lose the complexity of the reforms. It's kind of a separate but very related conversation.
I think that's really key, and it is why I think there is a proposal for exemption thresholds for, based on size. And I think getting those exemptions defined well as a key way to address that concern. The current levels are all sort of megawatt scale consumption within a given region, which is a pretty large consumer of electricity. So there's also a proposal to exempt small and medium enterprises, which would be more of a kind of enterprise level definitional concern, meaning that, companies that meet those SME definitions, which are pretty widely used in a variety of places, have less staff and less resources to do complicated accounting. And so maybe they would be exempt. The good news is that electricity consumption is heavily concentrated in a few big companies. And so we can exempt the vast majority of companies from these, more onerous reporting requirements and still capture 85, 90% of electricity consumption in a given region, because it is highly skewed towards a few very large consumers in industries like data centers and computing and petrochemicals, and heavy manufacturing, aluminum smelters, pulp and paper. So there is a small number, and those large electricity consumers are very sophisticated electricity consumers. They're consuming huge amounts of power. They are already doing long-term contracting and hedging strategies and all kinds of other things. And so for those customers, it's unlikely to be, I think, a barrier to do this procurement, which is less complicated than buying power in the market, which is already highly temporal and highly spatially, disaggregated and highly complicated. So I just think that's important to keep in mind. And I would support, that's why, in my comments, I would support a reasonable exemption threshold that makes sure that we're not making small companies, take on an unnecessary reporting burden.
Yeah, Gavin, you have something to add? Yeah.
Just one economics 101 point. If we all agree that we want more money deployed, in a voluntary program, raising prices frequently causes less money deployed. And so I think we need to look at the historical record. What is the price elasticity? What has been the pattern of firm behavior? What we've seen in the past when these prices have gone up, actually you've seen a significant drop in the market. And it could be different for the hyperscalers, but we should be really hesitant there.
But if you agree that most of that existing consumption is non-consequential, it's non-additional, then
this gets to the meat of it.
Why do you care?
So I don't care if low impact renewable energy goes away, frankly. Like, I think some people are really scared about that. I actually would support that. I care because I do not agree that the empirical data supports the claim that the more impactful locations are more expensive. When we've actually looked at the price of renewable energy compared to what we know about how clean those grids are, what the impact is, it does not support the claim.
Using short run or long run marginal emissions accounting?
Using long run. You persuaded me, or I think you have a good point. You get the same answer if you do short run. Either way you look at it.
You don't get the same answer if you use short run, right? It's highly context dependent. You do if it's coincidental, right? Maybe
I agree that it's not a perfect correlation.
That the short and long run emissions align, but that's a total coincidence, right?
Great. What I can say is we've looked at every long run model we could find. We've used UN data, we've used transition zero data, we've used open energy data, Baringa data, systematically over and over again. What we find is that many of the highest impact locations are cheaper. And the really big difference on additionality is long-term contracts versus short-term procurement of RECs. We need to take seriously that money is not a good proxy for impact. I agree we want more resources spent, but we cannot assume that the more expensive, the more impactful. There's just no evidence for that.
So maybe I'll try to jump in a little bit, and I guess 2 points. The first is that I think it is clear that, building the renewable energy in the region of which the load is served is probably not the most impactful, most efficient thing. On the other hand, it is very hard to understand or figure out whether or not, if you build new wind farm in Texas or in the Midwest, whether that's going to be additional or not. And so I think the point that Jesse is making is that there's this trade-off that you have this benefit of the hourly matching, that it does get you, hopefully, higher priced EECs and additionality. I know we try to avoid the additionality term in these conversations, but it's sort of hard to avoid. But I think it's clear that there are probably cheaper ways out there to get those emissions reductions. It's just they're hard to get a handle on it. But I think I would also say is that, this comes back to the long-term contract questions. If you believe that these long-term contracts are really driving new wind and solar, then, that's an important issue. And if you are going to drive companies away potentially from long-term contracts, you would see a negative impact. Now, I was looking at the chat here, someone was asking, why wouldn't companies already hedging with long-term contracts, why would drive them away? I think there's this aggregation thing which could potentially be dealt with the exemptions. I think if you believe that the hedging value of the long-term contract is already what's driving it, then you would not believe that the long-term contracts are necessarily really driving additionality. Now, the research goes both ways on this. I mean, there's a lot of papers arguing both sides. I think you do see right now that almost every renewable energy project is built with a long-term contract. I can certainly imagine that if, somebody signs a single long-term contract with intermittent renewable, they would no longer be under that single contract be able to claim that they're 100% clean. And, then this question is that decrease the value of the long-term contract to the company? I don't know. I think, some might say that they shouldn't be able to claim clean and that this would incentivize people to enter into, more contracts with clean firm, which is going to be more, sorry, clean firm meaning, clean electricity that is on 24/7 and isn't intermittent like a wind and solar. Um, and that just caused me to lose my train of thought to define the term. But that's going to be more expensive, and there's a lot of I keep on coming back to it. There's a lot of uncertainty and potential trade-offs. I can see scenarios where this works out great, and everyone's entering into long-term contracts with geothermal and nuclear, and I can imagine a scenario where people throw up their hands and just say, I just don't want to deal with this. And I don't think this is a question that economics can tell us the answer to.
Aaron, I think you raised a great question in there of just, would you still sign the contract if you can't make the same claim? And that came up in our prep call among this group. Like, these current accounting rules have made it essentially table stakes to be able to say my company's 100% renewable. But is that actually the goal? Like, is that meaningful, or can these reforms bring us to a more sophisticated place in the conversation where you talk about why you're participating in renewable energy markets and how you're doing so? Because just saying 100% renewable because of 100% annual matching isn't particularly meaningful really to any stakeholder.
Any reactions to that? Okay.
I mean, I think that is part of the goal is raising the bar, right, for what these consequential, what these meaningful claims are, right? If you can, without really spending any extra money, buy, renewable energy certificates for 50 cents a megawatt hour, that's not, that is table stakes. It's not doing much in terms of impact. And so if we were going to allow companies to do that, to claim that they're 100% clean, 24/7, no matter where they are, they're going to make those claims. I think that, there's a lot of, again, as we talk about the economics incentives of hedging, of making these claims, there's also the question of like, what is the actual social proof or, social license value that companies are getting out of making these claims? Is it real? Is it not? These are, endlessly debatable as well. But I think that, what we're basically seeing is that as renewables get cheaper, it makes sense to raise the bar for what a, voluntary good actor claim looks like. And that's largely what this is trying to do. There are other ways in which one can make claims of positive benefit in the world besides the scope 2 accounting rules. And so I think we need to keep that in mind. There are other claims. In fact, one of the biggest impacts that we've shown in our research of hourly matching is likely to be the fact that it could pull forward demand for technologies that are needed when the grid looks like 100% 24/7 around the clock, clean supply, to today when we don't have that need, right? Today it's easy enough to meet your demand with some renewables during the daytime and some gas at night or whatever it is. And so by requiring hourly matching and deliverability, it might create early market pull for long duration storage, for more flexible consumption, for geothermal or nuclear. And we are seeing examples of that in the market. If that pulls forward the deployment of those technologies by 5 or 10 years and drives the accelerated market uptake or helps prove those technologies as commercially proven, it's likely that the consequential impact of that, while not precisely quantifiable, could vastly exceed the individual emissions profile of any given company, right? So there's different strategies. You could just go ahead and do that directly without worrying about hourly matching and just say, I'm going to go procure advanced technologies, right? Like the mission first, advanced procurement rules for various sectors are trying to do. So I just think we have to keep in mind that there is a goal here to have a better, more defensible, more accurate, and likely more consequentially impactful accounting scheme under scope 2. And then there's a variety of strategies companies can pursue to have a positive impact. One of those would be making higher claims under a revised scope 2 rule, but there are other strategies as well available.
Yeah, like picking up on that, I have one question. So the greenhouse gas protocol is a voluntary standard, right? So there nobody has to report on that. Do you see kind of the risk that if this standard is getting a little bit too complicated, that there will be just like other emerging standards coming up, and we will, for example, in the US, we have like three credit rating agencies. Do you see something happening also in the emissions accounting space that we just have like different ways to do it, and then we have different companies, and then everything gets eventually like more complicated for the final consumer to find out if this is like actually clean or not. Do you see this happening in the space, or do you see a risk that this would happen?
Well,
it's already
Christoph,
happening,
before
right?
we answer that, I just want to issue one correction, which is it started as a voluntary reporting framework, but now regulatory reporting requirements do reference that your numbers should be in accordance with the greenhouse gas protocol, essentially making it non-voluntary. And so I just don't want to lose the importance of ease of participation when it is no longer 100% voluntary globally.
Gavin, you're muted if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, it was interesting. Christine, that actually makes me calm down a little. So I think, I'm very focused on, for example, carbon measures. And oil company driven project is gaining a lot of ground. And when I meet with folks like Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but also companies, this is very explicitly one of the reasons that is given. And in a world where everyone must follow the GC protocol, I'm actually much more relaxed about hourly matching because my concern is like how much we are seeing companies exit. One, just like I'll acknowledge an elephant in the room. It is often assumed that the companies that are thinking about leaving the GC protocol are the same ones that are most opposed to this change. I actually think it's not the same companies. So what I keep hearing is it's the ordinary companies in the economy that are less famous, the really large, the steel giants, the aluminum giants. They are the ones thinking about moving away from this. And the couple of tech companies that have raised really concerns about this, they're actually probably the least likely to drop out. But we are seeing a real proliferation of standards. It's already happening that companies are making plans to leave over this. And actually, if they were mandatory, they'd be totally different.
It's also worth noting that there are increasing like real policy conditions that are aligning with the temporal and geographic deliverability, requirements that mitigates incrementality. That includes the clean hydrogen tax credit in the United States. It includes the CBAM in Europe and the rules required for measuring electricity input emissions for CBAM compliance purposes. So, there are a number of measures moving in that direction that are where real money is at stake. And so in some ways, this aligns with that sort of practical shift in the policy direction as well. It'll make it easier because then if you're doing CBAM reporting, you're also, doing the same rules for scope 2. So really, I think it's going to depend on, as in all these things, as a voluntary rule, it's going to depend on whether it serves the companies well or not. Is it going to serve them for regulatory purposes? Is it going to make it easier for them to comply with certain requirements like the CBAM or 45V? Is it going to make it easier for them to make credible claims that consumers value and therefore their brand, attains some value from that? I mean, those are the motivations companies has for doing this. Nobody's just doing accounting for accounting's sake, right?
Okay, so since we have Christine here from a data center developer company, I have one like very specific questions because it's been coming up more and more so. So you have sometimes you build a data center, you have multiple tenants, right? So who owns the rec contract? Is it the data center or are it the tenants? And how do you define the operational boundaries? How do you allocate it within the data center? So it's kind of like a question is like, what we're trying to solve on the electric grid, I think you're trying to solve internally in your data center, right? So who is responsible for what? And what is the discourse in that space? And is there something you can add to the discussion?
Sure. You're not the first one to raise this question, and I think every participant in the industry may have a different answer, but really due to the flexibility of selecting your organizational boundary that's granted within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there are multiple defensible answers, and it really comes down to information and data sharing with your fellow stakeholders. And so it can and it does look a variety of ways between the data center owner and the tenants and who purchases and retires the RECs. And it really comes down to traceable accounting of who did what allocated to what load, and then sharing that information in a verifiable way to say, this retired REC is attributable to these megawatt hours at this site at this time.
Okay. Anyone else something to add on this tenant question on data centers? I found it interesting. If not, then I'll propose to move on to audience Q&A. The first question I want to ask is, how does energy storage interface with hourly matching and deliverability requirements?
Yeah, so this is one area where hourly matching, where energy storage now has a role to play, right? If you're doing annual, REC-based accounting, right, there is no role for energy storage because you don't care when the generation occurs. Under an hourly matched scenario, then you do care because you need to align your consumption and production. And so tracking approaches basically for measuring the ingestion of EACs by a storage device that's consuming at the same time from deliverable clean supply, and then releasing that later, just like there is for the power, and that accounts for losses, round trip losses as well. So if you have 100 units of EACs in, you can only discharge or send later 93 units or whatever the round trip efficiency is of the storage. But it gives a direct role for storage and demand flexibility and various other strategies to better align supply and demand to make it easier for companies to meet those requirements. And that's almost certainly going to be a part of any portfolio that someone uses to get to high 90+% hourly matching requirements. It's going to have to include some degree of demand flexibility and or storage to better align those things, unless you're just buying a fully dispatchable geothermal plant or something like that.
Maybe I can just add a little. I think Jesse's definitely right. I do wish there was a little more detail in the proposal about how the storage and how the EECs would get transferred in practice. So I hope that can be filled in at some point. I do think there is a sort of the same kind of potential operational inefficiencies that we talked about. The deliverability can happen with storage is if you're optimizing, when you discharge the storage to sort of match load and get EECs, that may not be the most efficient in terms of the operation of the grid. So, again, this proposal does do a lot, but it's, there are these potential inefficiencies along the way that can increase costs. So it's just always, I know, again, it's always comes back to these trade-offs.
Christine, do you and I'm putting you in the industry category. Do you observe this discussion about storage, and is this something people in the industry talk about, that this is something that's kind of necessary or important piece?
I think just like Aaron, we're just waiting to see some of those details filled in.
Okay. The next question, and we hinted at that already, but I just want to, because it came from the audience, just want to be very clear again. Are the three pillars, meaning hourly, spatial matching, and incrementality, additionality, the most efficient way to induce additionality? Does this conversation assume that the cost of renewables will keep getting cheaper?
No, it's not the most efficient way to induce additionality, and I don't think anybody has any, presumption that it is. I guess my assertion is it is the most effective way, not efficient from a cost perspective, but most effective way to adapt an input-based, empirically observable accounting scheme like the GHG Scope 2 into a strategy that has more consequential impact in today's market environment. So if I were to say I have $100 to spend, how do I maximize the emissions impact from that? That's a purely consequential question. We will never be able to precisely measure what that impact is exactly for the same kind of empirical counterfactual challenges that I've talked about before. But I could probably come up with heuristics or strategies that are likely to have a high consequential impact, per dollar spent, and that's, I think, a good thing for companies to be thinking about and doing as well. It's just not something you can put into an accounting scheme like this because there's, no way to observe what the actual impact is. And so you end up with what you see in the offsets world, which is 10 different standards that measure it in 10 different ways, and companies encouraged to pick the one that gives them the lowest number, right, or the highest emissions offset number, or lowest, net emissions impact. And that naturally drives towards the kind of lowest common denominator outcome, which I think is concerning. So, yeah, it's not the most efficient way, but it is the best of the proposed accounting-based schemes at driving that kind of impact.
I want to say it doesn't guarantee additionality, right? I
No.
mean, there is you can, particularly with the increment without the
Yeah.
incrementality condition, you hourly match existing nuclear
An
plant.
existing nuke. Yeah.
You're not doing
Exactly.
anything. And even with the incrementality, there's always, renewable energy that's going to get built no matter what you do. And so it's important that I would say it increases the likelihood of
Yes.
additionality, particularly if you get people buying those high-priced EECs, but none of these things guarantee additionality. And that's true in the offset world even more so.
Agreed.
I think I really agree that the risk of shopping additionality standards is a big one. I think that in any world where we have an additionality test, it really does need to be based on observables, as you're saying. I don't think this is the most efficient one that is practical. I think, for example, we have a lot of information that renewable energy is so cheap now. When you ask renewable energy developers why they aren't building more, very, very often they talk about risk and long-term access to capital. We have a lot of empirical evidence that long-term contracts really work. I also think there's a lot of really empirical things you can do on tests where renewable energy isn't getting built. You have very, very high certainty of additionality in Azerbaijan, where there's a 0% build rate. I really agree, though, that a world where we list 10 tests and every company could pick its own test is a terrible approach. So I would love to see a version of the market-based method that pulls on some of the standardized consequential tests that have been really proven to work. I would love to see it sit next to hourly matching. I think hourly matching is a solid step forwards in that. But I think I would push back on the idea that it's the only solid method we have. It's just we need to avoid a shopping problem.
But do you have another accounting method that depends on observable outcomes that you can propose? Because no one's proposed it in the 2.5 years we've been having this conversation.
Well, I don't agree with that because the Scope 2 technical working group did propose a method. They proposed to go with Matthew Brander's method, which were based on empirical research from Keel and Water. It actually seems to show pretty clearly that long-term contracts are a very good proxy for additionality. Completely agree, it's not a perfect guarantee, but
Yeah.
that has
But that
been
also
shown to
implies
work.
that also implies that the annual accounting requirements are what drives the long-term contracting, which no one has established.
Um,
Historically, that probably was true when they were above market renewables, but when they're not above market, that's a pretty questionable claim, I think.
I mean, I think what we can see is we see that when PPAs are signed, you do see actually more than one unit per one. So you actually see a surplus of renewable energy that exists relative to other locations that didn't have those PPAs. This is a fact.
That's
We
that's
also
not a
know that
fact.
when RECs are
That's an estimated counterfactual. It's not a fact. Right? This is the problem, is it's just not observable. It's an estimated counterfactual, just like any other estimated counterfactual.
I
And
think
you
if
can
you're
make your claim and somebody else can make another claim, and then we're stuck. And so this
But
is
by
why it
that
doesn't
logic,
work as an
randomized controlled
accounting scheme.
trials don't work, medicine doesn't work. If you say all counterfactual analysis is completely useless for policy, we're in a world where we have to throw out
I'm
huge amounts of
I'm
science.
saying that so again, if your goal is to say this has a positive impact that is not
Mhm.
quantified precisely, one can establish that. Just like one can establish that
Mhm.
there's a positive effect of a medical,
Yeah,
drug in trial. Can you account for empirically exactly what that effect is? No, because you can run the same, random experiment with five
true.
different, causal identification methods and
Yeah.
come up with five different numbers. And so this is where I think it just doesn't work in an accounting-based scheme. It works as a guide for how to have positive consequential impact in the world. It does not account for a, input-based accounting method. And these are just two different things. And no one has proposed an approach that gives you an accounting scheme that, other than just
That is
stick with
input
what we have
based.
right now, right? Which is annual matching, which you've been deeply critical of in the past.
Agree with you about that.
So like, let's move forward with this, get this improvement to the accounting scheme done, and then we can come up with impact guides for companies who want to have positive impact, right? There's lots of ways to have positive impact. I can buy clean water for people in places that don't have access to clean water. I can pay for nets for malaria. I can help install air conditioning in places that are getting hotter. There's lots of ways in which companies can do good in the world, and they make those claims and they do it and they market it in different ways to improve their brand loyalty. That there's a lot of ways to do that in the energy world as well. They just don't belong in this bucket.
I really agree with you because you said input-based. So I don't mean to say that what I'm talking about is an input-based method. I do think it does not need to be the case that the market-based method is input-based. I think maybe we have a different prior there on how essential is that. But I like what they did with market-based and location-based. I think it is possible to have two metrics. I think that I have a lot more faith in counterfactual analysis when many studies, many people using different methods get really similar answers. Totally agree with you. We're never going to know the exact causal effect of anything. That's not how causality works.
Right.
But I think the more we see general alignment, which really has been happening, that most empirical studies find the same answer, different methods, different people.
They find the same qualitative answer, right, Gavin? They find the same qualitative answer that this is a positive impact of some magnitude. It doesn't have, none of them agree on quantity. Right.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting closer and closer. So I really agree with you that the numbers, you can't be perfect about what is the exact causal effect of anything ever. I think the question is, what do we really know? And actually, I really like, Jesse, how you said this sometimes, that you have to base an accounting system on things you can observe. It has to be facts that are uncontestable. And then you have to use science for what is our best understanding of what is impactful here. I think that, yeah, some people have the idea that marginal emissions are going to peg every exact number precisely. That's not what they do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this, it's accounting, but it's for many people is a very emotional topic, as you could see. We are reaching the end of the hour and 15 minutes. I would like to thank the speakers for the contribution. I think you added excellent context to this revision of the greenhouse gas protocol. I also would like to thank our attendees for joining us, for posing excellent questions. I hope you got some answers out of it from this panel. Keep out looking for future upcoming webinars from the Institute for Policy Integrity. We are aiming to make this recording public. If you're interested in hearing more from us, please subscribe to newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. And thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.